I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, today we are looking at a poem, or is it 3 poems? I'm not sure, by Su Dongpo, called Drunk, I Walk Along Everywhere and Visit the House of the Four Lees.
It's a great title. Leaves a, it's hard to figure out really what it's about from the title. It's very subtle. But this is what I love about a lot of these poems, these great Song Dynasty poems, is they can be so powerfully literary and yet give the impression that they just don't care about being powerfully literary. I mean, this title, who would title, like if you saw this as the title of a poem now, you'd probably think, I don't know, that sounds kind of, I don't know if I can go too far with this one.
Rob, do you think that move is the height of pretension, or do you think it's a sign that Su Dongpo really doesn't care? Because this poem is incredibly elusive. It's incredibly hard to read because you have to know all of these different texts that he is alluding to. What do you make of it?
Well, that's one of the things I love about the Su style. I honestly think it's my favorite pre-modern Chinese poetry.
More so than the Tong.
More so than the Tong. It depends on the day. What I love about it is that it's attempting to retain a connection to folk songs and song traditions that all other forms of Chinese poetry grow out of. The Zi poem continues to have its titles as actual just song titles, existing song titles. Like we talked once in a different podcast about if all poems are written to Jay-Z's Big Pimpin' and they were just called Big Pimpin', but it had nothing to do with that at all. It just happened to fit that song. They retain this sort of nudge, nudge, wink, wink humor about them, and yet you only have to read a few of Su Dongpo's poems to know this is incredible stuff. So the question of, is it the height of pretentiousness? I honestly don't know. It reminds me of some of the better / most pretentious indie rock and other forms of indie music, where you'll have an album with like 18 words in it and all the song titles are. Do you ever listen to Sufjan Stevens?
No.
Okay. He's got an album called Illinois, or Come Bring the Illinois. I forget how you really phrase it. Anyway, each song is like a story, like a whole full couple of sentences. And yet it's a pretty incredible piece of music. So what do we do with that? I don't know. What do you think? Is it super pretentious?
I don't think it's pretentious. I think that it comes off really well, and I think Su Dongpo is just that freaking smart, and he and the readers that he's writing to are just so deep in these different texts that even though they're being incredibly elusive and alluding to books from hundreds of years ago, he expects that everybody is going to know them, and he's probably right when he does that. Rob, should we just go ahead and... Is it okay if I read my translation?
Read your translation. Go for it.
So this is Drunk, I walk alone everywhere and visit the houses of the Four Lees. Half drunk, half sober, I go over to visit the Lees. The bamboo is pokey, the vines smack me. I'm more and more lost with each step. I can only follow the cow poop, seeking a way back. My house is at the cow pen, west, just a little west. Poem number 1. Here's poem number 2. The Lee's 3 boys have their hair tied back in buns. They blow on grass as a whistle that welcomes me, this old man. Don't feel like you're at the end of the world 10,000 miles away. Beside this creek, they have a tradition of doing a rain dance. Poem number 3. My friend, Old Fu, is still horny, but what about how old he is? His good-looking face is disappearing, but the white hairs on his temple keep coming. Each time he hits on the girl next door, she smacks him in his teeth. Each time he tries to trade a fan for you-know-what, he finds himself facing an old lady. So first off, Rob, I think we should mention this poem is written in 1099. Su Dongpo is down in Hainan, which is today a vacation getaway for many Chinese folks and also for a lot of Russians. It's kind of the Daytona Beach of China, if you will. Back in the day, in the Song Dynasty, it was about as far away as you could get from the imperial palace and still be in an area considered to be quote unquote China. I'm not entirely sure if it's even right at this point to talk about China. This is the backwoods of the backwoods, and he's been banished there again by the emperor. We talked a little bit about Su Dongpo, Wang Anshi, and their fight over economic reforms. He's banished because he has once again lost the battle in the fight over economic reforms. What do you make of this poem, Rob?
Well, it's funny because I feel like when a lot of tzu, no matter how well you translate them, they can sound so colloquial that it almost doesn't feel like quote unquote poetry. This is a pretty solid translation. And I'm wondering how you feel about this. Do you think Su Dongpo's poetry in particular, we should be able to appreciate it on multiple registers? Like, could we just read this as a kind of wistful reflection on life in the boonies? And also, if you choose to put in the spade work, as a deeply elusive text? Or do you think it needs to kind of stick with the deeply elusive text reading?
I think it can be both. You know, that first poem, especially Half Drunk, Half Sober, it seems like he's reflecting on life in exile. You know, he's been banned from the imperial centers. He's been forced to make a life as best he can. I think he would have perceived it as a barbarian space. Certainly, a lot of his contemporaries would have thought of it in terms of its barbarianness. And that's one of the things I think Su Dongpo is reflecting on in this kind of melancholic, half-drunk, half-sober state. He's drunk because that's the way he deals with his sadness at being in this backwater. I mean, he lives beside a cowshed, and the only way he can find his way back home as he's struggling drunkenly to get back home is to follow the cow pies. That's what's going on in this first poem. So it's definitely meant, I think, to be a comment on life in exile. But in that second poem, he seems to be finding some joy in living in the boonies, right? He's rejecting this notion that there's nothing good and worthwhile to do in the backwoods where he's at. He finds joy in the tradition of the rain dance. He finds joy in the way the three boys from the Lee family tie their hair back in buns. This is a different tradition from what he's used to, but he's making the best of it. Yeah, the third poem, I don't know what to do with it. That poem is very elusive. It's alluding to the Jin Shu, which is a book written in 648 by Tang historians. After each dynasty, the new dynasty would write the book on the old dynasty. Quite literally, it's just called, you know, the Jin Shu or whatever. That's what this line is alluding to. There was apparently a person of historical importance named Xie Kun tried to flirt with a woman. Then the woman would throw a weaving shuttle and break his two teeth. So that's what this line here is going for. It's almost so elusive that it was kind of impossible to translate. I couldn't really be true both to the text and maintain something that was comprehensible in English.
Right. And yeah, but let's bring this back to, though, a question that you asked me when we read Ouyang Xiu's Shihua, bits of his Shihua. You know, the first two are deeply elusive. Maybe the third is too, but is it possible that he's writing it for the sheer comic relief? I mean, the poems could be about literally anything you could possibly imagine. So you have to imagine the motivation to write it also was that. So could he just be going for a laugh?
I think that's definitely part of it. This is a funny text. I mean, he's alluding to these 500-year-old stories, talking about flirting with, sexually harassing. I don't know how to describe what he's doing. The locals just being wasted.
So let me ask you this question. There's a French film, it's a comedy film they released a decade or so ago called Welcome to the Sticks, Bienvenue chez les Ch'tis, and it's sort of about this guy from a really big, I think he's from Paris. Anyway, he gets sent up north where no one wants to go. No one in France wants to work way up north. That's where all the sort of French version of hillbillies are supposed to live. At some point, they have a sequence where they're the people that he becomes friends with are trying to convince a visitor that things are really as bad as everyone thinks they are. And so they turn themselves into the most horrible stereotypes imaginable. And so there's like a 10-minute comedy sequence of them just of the whole town being like this complete backwater. So he's writing a poem, and he knows it's probably going to be read by the kind of people who would appreciate what he's doing. So not the backwater people he's hanging out with, someone back in the empire. And I'm wondering if he's sort of playing up just how rustic and ridiculous it looks, but at the same time doing it with the kind of language only the great poets could use. That in some ways makes it an archetypal Tzu poem, because a great Tzu poem uses incredibly beautiful and elusive language to sometimes talk about the lowest possible thing. So in some ways, it's almost like Su Dongpo thumbing his nose at the people that sent him out there. Like, I'm going to find the most ridiculous backwater subject you can think of, and I'm still going to write better poetry than you do.
I think he definitely is thumbing his nose at the people who sent him down into exile. I don't know that it's like you were suggesting with the French film, just because if you look at who's misbehaving, it's not the locals. It's, his old friend. He's misbehaving. He's wasted. The locals they seem perfectly nice, right?
So I'm curious. So Old Fu is not one of the locals?
I don't think so. Old Fu is one of his old friends. I don't know that much about who. So this Old Fu is named Fu Lin. I don't think he is a local, or if he is a local, I don't know how they became old friends.
That's true. The old friend thing would, yeah.
Su Dongpo has just recently been sent down into exile. He's going to die, I think, 2 years later. After this, he's going to be moved out of exile. He'll lose his status as a complete exile, and I think he's making his way back to the centers of imperial power when he dies. During the fights between the conservatives and the reformers, which Su Dongpo is very much in the conservative camp, Su Dongpo several times gets sent into exile. This is the point at which he gets sent farthest into exile, but it's not like he's been here for a long time.
True. So that's definitely clears that up. But it is interesting because then if he's writing about one of his old friends who happens to be a bit of a lech back home, it's kind of interesting that he puts those alongside. So the first stanza of the first poem, I suppose, is him, a representative of the empire, stumbling back through cow doo-doo on his way back home. Can you think of something more ignoble for someone like Su Dongpo's status? Like, what the heck?
It's
in
perfect.
A backwater town, like, yeah, whatever. The second poem is about the locals who are welcoming and kind and don't make him feel like he's living far away. And even that line, they have a tradition of doing a rain dance. The implication is that there's something beautiful, there's something almost poetic about the way these people act. And then you have a third poem about yet another person from the imperial center, quote unquote, being an idiot. So you have a guy being an idiot and another guy being an idiot as the sandwich around locals not being idiots, which is interesting.
It's hard to make heads and tails out of this poem, this set of poems. I don't even know how to categorize it, but it's a really fun poem. It kind of is melancholic. It's funny. It's poignant. It's this meditation on exile. So much is going on here, Rob.
Yep. It's Su Dongpo.
It's Su Dongpo. That's right.
Dear listener, there's a good chance that you probably already know who Li Bai and Du Fu are from poetry classes. If you haven't read much Su Dongpo, do yourself a favor and go do so immediately. I love Su Dongpo.
Check out our series on Song Dynasty poetry. We did it. How long ago did we do it, Rob? Like
10 months ago or something like that? Maybe a year ago. Yeah, something like that.
Anyways, check that out. I think that's a good place to end it. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.